we were doing a reading in my algorithmic fairness class just yesterday, actually, that was talking about, like hypothetically, even if we could automate things in a way that's extremely fair and, reduces bias, would we want to? Is that a smart solution, to essentially reduce the like moral uncertainty and like the political decision making that comes with like human decisions, right? Like, do we even want to automate, academic outputs? Is that even something we want to do? Even if it can get, reliably good at, predicting which is going to have good publication success, like, is that even something we would want,
Welcome to Disrupted Science, the occasional conversation between the authors of the upcoming book, How the Internet Disrupted Science, now available for pre-order in print and in ebook form. So go grab an early copy, please. I'm Kent Anderson here with my co-author Joy Moore, and today is Wednesday, January 21st, 2026.
We finally made it. A couple weeks
Yeah.
late.
Hey, Joy.
Hey, Kent, how's it going?
Good. We have to fess up. The first two episodes were 2025s. We misdated our checks.
I
For
know
those who remember those days.
that was exactly what I was thinking about, is
Yeah.
it takes you back to writing checks,
Yep.
and that's when you learn what year it is and what year it's not.
You scrawl them out. So today we've got a fantastic episode for people. We're talking to Skylar Hughes, who is a graduate student at Oxford, at the Oxford Internet Institute. She's studying social science of the internet and graduated from Duke, gave a great TED Talk, is a super smart person, and I think singularly like reinforced my belief that younger people deserve a better world than the one we're leaving them, but
Yeah,
they'll be okay too.
she's definitely one to watch. She has some very interesting research areas. She has a background as a fact checker at CNN and other places. And so she's taking a very critical eye to what the information space is like today. And that's where she's doing her research and writing. And she's also really great about explaining
Oh, she's a great
concepts.
communicator.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
fantastic communicator. So we're not gonna stand in the way between you and Skylar. So, without any further ado, here's our interview with Skylar Hughes. Reading about Skylar Hughes is like reading about the early days of a superstar. A ballerina, a young academic powerhouse, and a community and psychological researcher for years already, Skylar went from high school in Georgia to attending Duke University, her dream at the time. She's worked as a fact checker at CNN and caught our eye with her TEDx Duke talk about social norms around truth. Since then, she has graduated from Duke and is now pursuing a master's in the social science of the internet at the Oxford Internet Institute. We're thrilled to talk with her today. Hi, Skylar.
Hello.
Hi, great to meet you.
I'm
Thanks for
so
joining
excited
us.
here. Thank you for having me.
So, where are you right now?
I'm currently in the library at
Okay.
Oxford.
At
Oh,
Um,
nice.
Oxford.
yes,
Wow.
we finished finals last Thursday was my last final, and then we
Hmm.
started the next term on Monday. So it's been a very busy few weeks, but I'm really excited to be back.
You enjoying it
How,
there?
yeah, how do
Pardon?
you like it?
I really love it. I love it. I think it's just been such a expansion of what I learned in undergrad. In undergrad, I majored in psychology and policy journalism. And then here, studying internet science is a very interdisciplinary program, which I was very interdisciplinary in undergrad, but it's building on what I learned. So we're learning a lot about like AI, we're learning a lot about the internet, misinformation, technology, and governance. So, like, how do you govern like social media or other technology platforms, algorithmic fairness and accountability, subversive technology. So, it's like a lot of really cool stuff. And I think my passion for misinformation fits in so well, especially with like the introduction of modern AI and
We're going to have a
governance and
lot to
stuff.
talk about.
Yeah, I'm excited.
So we discovered you through your TEDx talk that you gave at Duke. I think that was in December. Is that right?
So I
Uh,
gave the talk in February, and then it was chosen as an editor's pick. So they waited to publish it until December. So it's been almost
Oh,
a year
wow.
now.
oh, I didn't
Yeah.
know.
That's interesting. I didn't know
I
that
didn't
happened.
know there was an editorial
Yeah.
process for
Yeah.
those. Yeah. So it and the title of your talk is we're all being lied to, and here's why no one cares anymore. What was your inspiration for this?
Yeah, I think broadly, I've always been fascinated by misinformation. When I was a child, I was majoring in marine science, but my goal was to major in marine science and journalism because I was really dumbfounded by all of the climate change misinformation that
Mhm.
existed in the broader world. And then I took a psych class and I changed my primary major to psychology. But I think what really made me decide that I wanted to do a TED Talk was when I was interning at CNN in 2024. I got the opportunity to work a lot of political events, such as like the presidential debate and also the Republican National Convention. And during both of those events, obviously, this was a really wild political time, specifically in the US. And I just remember seeing so many falsehoods, and misinformation is not new. Like it dates back to the Roman Empire in a lot of ways, and neither is propaganda. But I think the spread of misinformation has really been exacerbated by digital technologies.
Mhm.
And so seeing just the sheer amount of misinformation that was spreading through the election cycle, and then also seeing people's kind of numbness to it and the lack of reaction from it, not just from them, but also from fact checkers, fact checking the same lies every single day, and the same claims every single day, you kind of become numb to it and you forget that like this is a big problem that like people are lying in so many different spheres and there's so many falsehoods. And so it made me really interested about like social norms around misinformation and what was driving that. And I'd already done some research. My freshman, well, going into my sophomore summer, I was an ethics fellow at the Keenan Institute at Duke, and I studied the ethics of misinformation. And I did a lot of like qualitative interviews with different professors, like at the Stanford Media Lab and also at Duke. And so I learned a little bit about it there. But I think studying it there and then seeing it practically at CNN is what made me realize, okay, I think this is a big problem that people want to hear about. So
Yeah.
Yeah, and
yeah.
it's promulgators know what they're doing, right? They talk about flooding the zone purposely to
Yeah.
numb people to the effect that they're just swimming in polluted
Mhm.
waters all the time, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So, and
Um,
we kind of care about it from the scientific papers point of view because now we have a Secretary of Health and Human Services who actually does swim in polluted waters
mhm.
for sport. So there you go. Sometimes truth is stranger than fiction.
Yeah.
But
Hmm.
you talk about you make some interesting distinctions, some ones we've heard before, but then others that we haven't heard quite as clearly as you put in your talk, which we will put in the post that will accompany this,
Mhm.
and a link to it in the show notes as well. So you talk about misinformation versus disinformation, right? And mistakes versus deceptions. I kind of think about it in my mind as the difference between littering and pollution, right?
Mhm.
It's like sometimes I fumble a gum wrapper and that's a mistake, right?
Right.
But then
Hmm.
there are people who are actively polluting the information
Right.
landscape. Can you talk a little bit just about those from your perspective, though, if you don't mind?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, just broadly, I think a good kind of like word to word or discursive way to remember it is misinformation stands for mistake, and then disinformation stands for deception. But really, I think of misinformation academically, it's just defined as like any time that there's information that's put out into the public that is false. And so you can think of it broadly like, when I was working at CNN during my time, there were a few times when we published something, we realized that it wasn't correct, and we took it down, we amended it, and then we noted that we made a factual correction. And that would be seen as misinformation. I think there's been kind of a politicization of the word misinformation and of the term fake news. But when you think about it literally, that's what the definition of misinformation is. And then disinformation refers to intent. And so that's when you kind of get some of the psychological aspect in because now you're inferring from people's behaviors, like whether or not they meant to lie or not. And I talk about in my talk how I find the most problem ethically with disinformation because
Hmm.
you are purposefully trying to deceive other people. And I think it creates a lot of issues around like information asymmetry, where certain groups of people or certain types of people are privileged to more accurate information than others. And then we also have lots of research showing that like certain protective factors like socioeconomic status and education allow certain people to have more protection against like believing in conspiracy theories or false narratives than others. So it is like kind of in a way disinformation is exacerbating the social inequalities that we already have in the United States. And I
Right, and
think
what that brings to mind is a lot of the tech people won't allow their kids to use iPads, right?
right, right.
They don't want them on the web because they know it's a It's a bad place. So,
Yeah,
you
it's
know,
it's a lot. Yeah, and I think even learning
the
about like
hypocrisy is central to all of this too.
yeah, yeah. And I think even learning about the way algorithms work here at the Internet Institute and understanding that like it oftentimes accuracy has, such a small role in
Hmm.
how they measure like how well the algorithm is doing. And so you can think about that in terms of like searching or indexing algorithms on Google. Google doesn't prioritize a ton how accurate the first 10 results are.
Right.
And you're seeing like an information overload where like we're having increasing access to more and more amounts of information. And, people are cognitive misers, so they're only going to click on the first one, two, or three links, even if Google's not indexing those links by any metric of like truth or accuracy or accessibility. So it just creates more issues with this information, which is, being exacerbated by digital systems.
Right. And you also talk about believing lies versus condoning lies. And can you walk us through that distinction
Yeah.
as well?
Yeah, so I kind of like to think about it. I learned in my journalism class, we got the chance to talk to Bob Woodward, who was one of the
Hmm.
lead journalists who broke the Watergate scandal.
Yep.
And I often think about it through his lens. He talked about how initially when Watergate broke, it was a big public scandal. Like the idea that a politician was lying was this really extreme case, and it was outside of the social norms at that time. And people reacted very, very negatively to it. And it eventually led to impeachment and, just huge political upheaval. But you think about it now, right? And that's people, they initially believed the lies that were put out, but they didn't condone it once they realized, oh, it was a lie. It wasn't just an accidental falsehood or like knowledge that was updated later.
Right.
Um,
Slip of the tongue or something like that. Right.
Right, right. But you can think about it now, where, the current president, for example, is putting out information to the public sphere. I think there was a study in The Guardian during his 2016 run that found that he lied an average of 21 times a day,
Hmm.
just putting all of his public lies together. And you seeing that,
It
specific
seems to have
group.
sped up.
Yeah, yeah. Um, and you're seeing that specific groups of people, either A, they believe the lie and they also are condoning the fact that it's a lie, or they don't believe it, like they recognize that it's a lie, but they condone the behavior because of their support.
Yeah.
And so it's like a
Right.
unique binary issue where you're seeing people, even if they know what he's saying is false and it's not helpful and it doesn't contribute anything, they don't care and they don't judge the behavior as negatively
Right. Or
anymore.
they think he's playing four-dimensional chess when he really just choking on a checker. So, yeah.
Yeah.
So, some of the other words you use very specifically, and I'd like you to walk us through a little bit. So, norms, normal,
Hmm.
normalizing, true versus normal. And then we'll
Hmm.
get to the last one, which is deception fatigue, which I think it all kind of wraps up to. And then you also, and you talked a little bit about smoking as an example of like all of
Hmm.
these things. So can you walk us
Hmm.
through that, please?
Of course. So norms would just be the kind of broad societal rules that govern how someone behaves in a social setting. So for example, when you're in an elevator, the social norm is either to be quiet or maybe have like small talk. But the social norm wouldn't be to like play music out loud or to dance around, right? But if you're in a club, the social norm wouldn't be to like stand in a corner. The social norm would be to dance and like be loud and have fun. And so social norms are very um, analogous with the way
Contextual.
that right. And
Hmm.
they drive human behavior because humans have this desire to fit in and be socially acceptable. It's like an evolutionary design where, you want to fit in and be part of a group. A lot of
Hmm.
psychologists used to think that humans, were very selfish people, but now there's actually a lot of research showing that, like, no, people actually want to behave in line with the group because you can share resources, you can allocate resources, and fundamentally, like, you need to depend on other people when you're a child to
Right.
develop and grow in the world.
Right.
So you can think of social norms broadly like that. It's contextual and it's around the society that you're in. And then I would say normal, how I define normal, it's built off of the, subword norm, just broadly like the societal basis or average for the behaviors that we perceive as normal. And you can
Hmm.
think about like Durkheim and, social deviance theory and the idea that like, because we live in a diverse society, society, objectively, there are going to be deviant attitudes and behaviors because there are lots of people. And, small amounts of deviance is normal. It helps us, talk about and argue what we want our social norm to be, what we define as normal. It promotes like moral cohesion. But we're seeing rises in deviant attitudes and behaviors. And so increasingly like defining what is normal, what's like average, what's an acceptable baseline versus what is weird is like really like important. Um, so there's that. And then you could remind me one more time the last two terms that you wanted me to define.
Normalizing and deception fatigue, but also and true versus normal, right?
Okay.
That
Yeah.
contrast.
So I would say true is just, you could think about like objective fact versus fiction. And I think you can see in society where, what's true, which is seeming like the normal existence mode for information is kind of like diverging. And I think
Mm.
that increasingly makes it harder to regulate information because you can think of regulation of like, oh, we're just going to regulate information that's true and information that's false. But now you have like information that's satirical, right? Like it's
Right,
false, but it's not really misinformation. Like the purpose is humor. So is it,
right. Well, and
really
always the
true?
fallback for some lies is he was just joking, it's just kidding.
Right, right.
Yeah.
And that, is another problem with regulating misinformation is like you can never, you know, really infer like intent behind someone's words. You
Right.
can
Yeah.
only infer the words that they said themselves. So I would say that broadly. And then the idea of weird is just, this was coined initially. Tim Walz was calling people weird on the
Yeah.
election campaign.
Wish he'd
Hmm.
kept it up.
And then Tim Walz, and the University of Washington, actually, they put out like a blog post just talking about how like the idea of like checking people for being weird and engaging in weird behaviors could actually be like a really, really poignant concept and a great way to get people to realize, oh, like I'm not participating in social norms.
Hmm.
And the normalizing is just essentially when you take something that might not be considered socially acceptable or normal, and by repeated like use or other metrics, like you're making it more acceptable into the public view. So you can think about like the Overton window and how like over
Right.
time what we deem as acceptable is slightly like expanding and expanding. And the more normal something is, the less like social repercussions we face for acting that way. And
Hmm.
social repercussions are one of the main drivers of human behavior, like we just talked about.
Yeah. Have you come across Yuval Noah Harari and his work
Yeah, I was
on
actually gonna bring the
gossip?
book. Yeah.
Yeah, because I always fall back to that, and the power of humans to gossip is our superpower, right? We
Hmm.
can we can check in on each other and share information and become larger information processing organism that
Right.
way. But the veracity of the gossip is really important to the recipients, and liars tend to be, ostracized or disbelieved pretty quickly in
Mhm.
an actually well-functioning gossip economy, let's say.
Right. Right.
And so I've used that before in talking with people about scientific papers. I'm like, that's our form of gossip, right?
Hmm.
Hey, psst, I think I found something over here. And then other people go,
Hmm.
oh, but your reputation's on the line if you do that. At least it used to be. But now it's been kind of normalized that you can just point at anything and argue that it's true. And now there are new narrative driven what we call gaslight articles, gaslight journals, gaslight science, where it's being promulgated specifically to, create what you talked about as deception fatigue, right? It's just, we can't trust anything. So we're just, we're not going to get our kids vaccines. We're just confused, right?
Right. Right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So, weird checking is something you talk about as opposed to fact checking.
Hmm.
Yeah, talk to us about that. I
Yeah.
love the
It made me
term.
slightly nervous.
Yeah, so I think like my undergraduate thesis, which is like now under review for publication, we did a
Congratulations.
lot of research. Thank you. We did a lot of research on the efficacy of fact checking, and this is, not a new field. There's been a lot of research on like how effective is fact checking.
Oh, while you're talking about your fact checking career, I have a
Yeah.
question for you because I've
Yeah.
known fact checkers in my life.
Hmm.
Do you collect oddities? Like things
Um,
that you found, like little things, little mistakes, the mistakes or things that you found that were wrong and kind of put them in a drawer somewhere to look back at later. Because I
mm,
found there's kind of a pack rat of mistakes tendency among fact checkers. They like to They like to they like to show off their pelts, you know.
Yeah, I think I've done like two types of fact checking. I've done like claims-based fact checking at the Poynter Institute, which is where I like fact checked actual like false claims. Like I worked
Hmm.
during the summer where the Titanic submersible event was
Mm.
happening.
Oh
So I did a
wow.
Oh,
lot of
wow.
that, right? But a lot of like,
So what was the weirdest fact check that you did
yeah.
on the Titanic?
I think the weirdest fact check I did, which like I surprised myself, was there was a lot of information going around that the Titanic submersible was being controlled by like a PlayStation controller, or an Xbox controller. I think it was PlayStation. And I was like,
Okay.
okay, I don't even know where people like got this idea from, but it was actually true. They had engineered the boat to be like controlled by that because it made for like ease of like use and like there was only a certain number of controls versus like a wide like panel. But when I
Mhm.
initially saw that, I was like, okay, I have to fact check this because this just doesn't make any sense. But then it was true. So I
It
was
was
It was
true.
true.
Oh my
Oh,
gosh.
yeah,
oh
so
wow.
I think that was
First
cool. But I
video
think
game ever.
right.
Yeah.
But I think that was the summer of like, yeah, the Titanic submersible and like the orcas situation. Um,
Yeah.
attacking boats. So it was like a very, very, exciting summer. But that was more like claims-based fact checking. And then I did editorial fact checking at CNN, where we would fact check every like podcast script, article, TV script, anything that like before CNN published it at The Row, which is now called CNN Fact Check, where you just go line by line and you fact check every single line. And there were a few pieces. We weren't allowed to like take any pieces from CNN, but there were definitely a few things that I like just like kept in my notes of like broad things of like, oh, they mistook this or they mistook that. And I think obviously CNN is a global publication and they have a lot of fail safes in place prior to it coming to CNN Fact Check, which is like the final approval process. But it would be little things that you don't even think to like that you don't even think would be wrong. Like I remember one time there was like a translation error where we were translating something from Russian to English, and the BBC had translated like these two words differently than CNN, but the two words were like really important. And I just remember like having to fact check that, but then like you're not a native speaker and like going through that whole process. And I thought that that was really interesting.
Mm.
Or, one time when we were doing a piece on like Russia and Ukraine, they misspelled a Ukrainian city, but they had misspelled it into like another city's name in Ukraine, but it was just the wrong
Oh.
one for the context. Yeah, and it's like stuff like that. It's really hard to catch.
Hmm.
So I caught stuff like that because I think it really pushed like my fact checking skills and like my ability to really spot like the smallest, because at the level of CNN, it was rarely like, oh, they said, Skylar Hughes, age 40, and I'm 22. It was,
Right.
really small, hard to find things like that. And so I think I kind of would keep little notes like that in my pocket. But yeah, I think it definitely, my fact checking skills grew a lot there. So very grateful.
That's
It is amazing
awesome.
how you develop a nose for that kind of stuff, though, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. And
But those are such good examples, and in terms of the detail involved in fact checking something before it comes out, right? There's a lot to go through. Um, but then you also advocate for weird checking.
right.
And that's, I think, might be a little more useful for a lot of people these days with so much information out there. So
Yeah.
talk to us about what you mean by weird checking.
Yeah. So I think my interest in weird checking started actually from when I was doing a lot of fact checking work and I kind of realized not necessarily the redundancy, but kind of like the limited benefit of trying to reactively, um, fix misinformation. Obviously, there's a lot of, cognitive, social, and affective drivers behind why people either seek out misinformation or, struggle to update their beliefs. And even within like the fact checking literature, there's a lot of research that shows that fact checks are only like mildly effective under like political or like personal norms. So, for example, like the research I did, research from countless psychologists and social scientists over the years have shown fact checks are actually very effective for trivial statements that people have never come into contact with before. So, if I read a statement that's like, "Oh, corn is purple," and then there's a fact check right after that's like, no, corn is yellow. It actually works very well at like successfully updating my beliefs. But when I read a statement about a political figure that I'm like personally involved with, or like a personal identity trait of mine, um, and then I read a fact check, it becomes a lot more difficult because then you introduce things like social identity theory and motivated reasoning and cognitive, confirmation bias, things like that. And so there's a lot of like barriers to fact checks working successfully. In the research that I did for my thesis, we looked at the moderation of attention on how effective fact checks were. And we found that fact checking was almost half as effective under scenarios of divided attention. So when people were focusing on two things at once versus full attention. Which I think, once again, when you think about how people are encountering fact checks online, people are rarely just focusing on one thing at a time. Like they might be reading a fact check on social media while they're walking in a subway station, or, seeing it on Instagram while there's an ad playing up top. And so, like, just the idea that fact checks don't even work as well in like a divided attention scenario, which is like 99% of people's lives. You
Hmm.
Yeah.
it was really, pushing me to think about, okay, well, like, what are other ways that, people themselves can work to ameliorate misinformation? And so I started thinking about the research that I did at the Keenan Institute, and I came up with the idea of like some sort of social norm thing that pushes people to revise their behavior, which then will prevent them from spreading misinformation in the future. And there's been a lot of research about like how effective social norms are at pushing people to revise their beliefs. And obviously things like Tim Walz and the University of Washington researchers, how they were talking about this idea of like calling things weird, I thought was really,
Hmm.
really effective, especially for a TED Talk where, I could talk about like regulatory solutions, or I could talk about like solutions that tech companies need to take on. But, I want to give people the sense that they have some sort of power, because obviously there's, the solution to misinformation is very multifaceted, right? It's not just one solution or the other. But I think giving people a solution that they can act on was really important to me. And so I thought weird checking would be a great way for people to feel like, oh, I have agency over whether or not someone spreads misinformation. And I think during the TED Talk, they really pushed the idea of like you need to make like unifying statements. You don't want to like cause divide. So you can't really say, one group or another group. But I think what I could have added, if I was able to, is I would have said I think weird checking works specifically well within specific in groups. So for
Hmm.
I'm a Democrat. If I weird check a Republican, the likelihood of it being effective is probably, marginal compared to if I'm a Republican and I fact check another Republican, right? Because the Republican assumes like their social norms within their specific group.
Right. They assume
Um,
Hmm.
intent. Right.
right. And so like a Democrat saying that I'm acting weird or out of line, it's like I wasn't assuming my social norms the way you are anyway. But if another Republican who I think is supposed to be acting like me, then is also like, oh no, this behavior is weird. Like this actually is like you're now really outside of your social norms. It will push me to like reflect even further about like, okay, even the people in my in group aren't thinking this way. Maybe I need to reconsider the way that I think.
Yeah.
It's yeah, it's kind of the most positive spin on peer pressure.
Hmm.
Peer pressure in the truest sense of the term, if you don't want to be weird among
Right.
your peers.
Or at the nightclub or wherever, right? Yeah.
Yeah, but it takes I really like it because it combines the intent um,
Hmm.
within a context,
Hmm.
within a community.
Right.
And that can be really powerful for getting people to, rein in what they're doing, what they're saying, and how they're acting. So
Right.
Yeah.
I
Right.
really appreciated that.
Yeah, thank
Yeah.
you. Thank you.
So I have you're studying AI and
Hmm.
things like that, how it applies to the information space. So just idle question. Would you consider scientific publishers adopting AI systems to be weird?
Um, I think it depends on how they're using AI in
Hmm.
context. I think the logic of AI is built on, Bayesian statistics and, using prior evidence to build new models. And so essentially the logic of AI is like it's a predictive machine. And something that we learn a lot about in my class is like when AI comes up with these outputs that are really biased or, misleading, that is not a bug of AI. It is a feature that is
Hmm.
inherent to the design of AI.
Right.
So, for example, when you're training AI on these really, misleading or false data sets, and then it's outputting stuff that's false, that's not a bug of the AI. That's just a feature of AI. AI is built on predicting and reproducing the data that it was trained on.
Hmm.
And so I think when I think about that, I think if they're implementing it in certain contexts where they're strictly using it for ways to maybe predict certain things, but then going in with a human and normatively checking that because AI, once again, it can predict things really well based on whatever data you've given it, but it can't make decisions about those predictions, and it also
Right.
can't question the data itself. And I think that is where like AI can be really efficient for those really quick predictive things, but the person deciding between those predictions, there has to be like contextual, like a normative person there because AI cannot make normative decisions. And so I think it needs to be like a strong balance. But I think widely because of like AI hype, people are kind of implementing AI systems everywhere and anywhere. Um, and we were doing a reading in my algorithmic fairness class just yesterday, actually, that was talking about, like hypothetically, even if we could automate things in a way that's extremely fair and, reduces bias, would we want to? Is that a smart solution, to essentially reduce the like moral uncertainty and like the political decision making that comes with like human decisions, right? Like, do we even want to automate, academic outputs? Is that even something we want to do? Even if it can get, reliably good at, predicting which is going to have good publication success, like, is that even something we would want, from like
Hmm.
Yeah.
a normative standpoint? So I think it's a very hard question. I think the way in
Yeah.
which they input AI is, I think, what would make it like weird or not weird for sure.
Right.
But
Right.
I like the way you frame that because it's to what end? It's
Mhm.
what we could do.
Right.
We could take something that's maybe not normative, but
Mhm.
call it normal.
Right.
But why?
Mhm.
What are what
Right.
what are we going to get out of it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So I want to shift a little bit to governance talk, and I
Mhm.
have my theory that my little pet theory about how we could govern the internet better. Have you heard of the fairness doctrine? Have you guys talked
Yeah.
about
Yeah.
that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So I'm a big fan of it because it emerged from when radio broadcast was new,
Mhm.
and there were a lot of operators using it to spread misinformation and disinformation, and the
Right.
government said that's not cool. We're not going to let that happen. We need to have a subtle way of regulating the electromagnetic spectrum, which I would
Mhm.
argue the internet is part of. And so they came up with the fairness doctrine, which talks about you need to have standards of equity, honesty, and fairness if you're going to broadcast. And it was repealed in 1987. And after that, you got Fox News, and then you had Section 230, and now you
Right.
have this whole platform economy of attention and attachment and all these other things operating without regulation. And look at where we've gotten. So it seems like equity, honesty, and fairness wouldn't be anything anybody would argue against, but they also seem very closely aligned to ideas of norms, normal, and normalization. Can you kind of talk about, how is governance being talked about now, moving forward to around the internet and information economies?
Mhm. Yeah, I really like the idea of the fairness doctrine. And I think it made a lot of sense, specifically like in the context and the decade that it, originated in. I think it gets a little bit more difficult in terms of like governing information. You can think about it like on a tech platform, because of two reasons. I think the first reason is that increasingly there is research showing and surveys showing that people are like falsely identifying with political parties. So, for example, like people are saying that they identify with being a Republican, or saying that they identify with being a Democrat, but then when they are tested for like the values that they have, they don't always align. And so you're
Mm.
seeing people kind of, identify with a certain party because of like a politician or because of like the social norms around that party. And I see this a lot being from Georgia, where, it's always a swing state. And, I see people
Yeah.
who are, on food stamps, they're on Obamacare, they're on Medicaid, and they voted for Trump and they consider themselves a Republican and a conservative. And it's just like ideologically, it doesn't align with like your lived experience,
Right.
and
Hmm.
your choice to, use government allocated resources and the idea of like a bigger federal government. But they would identify with that. And so then you have the problem with like, if you were to give people who identify as Republicans and people who identify as Democrats equal space, I think there would be like this cognitive dissonance where people are like saying things representing Republicans or conservatism, but it doesn't actually represent conservative values or Republican values, and vice versa with the Democratic Party. And
Hmm.
so I think that's a problem. And I also think there's just been like an extreme polarization between Republicans and Democrats, where not only is there like an increasing split, but like people are being pushed to farther and farther sides. There was a lecture I attended a few years ago, and they were essentially talking about how, algorithms essentially are programmed to predict patterns, and then
Hmm.
Hmm.
reinforce those patterns. And they were talking about how, when you think about social media algorithms, the entire point is like to predict someone, you need to understand their behavior and be able to effectively, like, before they know what they want to see, you know it. And the way that a lot of like tech algorithms do this is by like pushing people further and further to the side. Because if you think about it, like conceptually, whose behavior or whose like feed is more predictable, like a moderate Democrat or a far left Democrat, right?
Right.
Like probably
Hmm.
someone who's more, far
Stronger
right.
patterns.
Yeah. So algorithms like push you like increasingly polarized information, which is, that once again, it's just like it's not a bug, it's a feature, because their goal is to like get their prediction level as high as possible. And it's so much easier to predict people when like they have, similar views 100% of the time, straight ticket voters on either aisle. And so I think that would present an issue also, where like you're seeing people present these ideas where there's not a lot of nuance on either side and there's no conceptual overlap, which I think is a lot of the reason why like there is a struggle. Harari actually talks about this in his book Nexus, that he
Hmm.
published in 2024, where like he talks about like where are the conversations even being had in government that actually leads to like agreement or like an actual change in someone's mind. Like
Right.
people are
Resolution.
so far to the side, right? That like when they come together and try to talk, there's literally no overlap in their like opinions and their beliefs, even, in the information that they're receiving, right? The algorithm is pushing one
Hmm.
Yeah.
side of information, other side. And so like there's no overlap. And so
Right.
it
No
just,
shared reality.
right. And so then it can cause even more polarization.
Right.
Um,
So
yeah.
that's why I
And
So
think
what
like
and
the
uh,
truth and fairness are kind of
mhm.
the big things. And I personally would propose that you and I spearhead a new version of it called the weirdness doctrine.
Yeah, that would be great.
as I was listening to you talk about the algorithms pushing people to the polar opposites, that's where they can be most identified and monetized, right? That's the whole point
Right.
is somebody's going to make money by having you in a bucket. Um, and then at the same time, a lot of there's a lot of rhetoric out there telling people to do their own research.
Right.
And so it's don't trust the experts, but
Hmm.
go in your algorithm,
Hmm.
stay in your algorithm and do your own research
Right.
about topics that might be important to you. Has that come across any of this stuff that you've been working on?
Yeah, definitely. I remember when I was interning at the Pointer Institute, actually, MediaWise, which is like the sub-organization that does, all of the fact checks and digital literacy stuff. They had a collaboration with Crash Course, and Hank Green specifically on digital literacy.
Mm. Hmm.
And he had one video that I really, really loved, and he talked about this like loss of trust that we have in other people to be able to reliably give us information. But like the conceptual problem with that is like there is no logical way for one person, me, you, any other person in the world, to be an expert on every single like domain. It's just like
Hmm.
fundamentally impossible. There's so much research. I think there's millions of research articles published every single year, right? Which is another problem in
Right.
and of its own. But like being considered an expert in a field where all that there is to know is incredibly difficult just in one specific research question in one subdomain, let alone every single domain on Earth. And so that reveals, the fundamental need to learn how to trust other people to give us information outside of our own domain of expertise, right? Like when we get on a plane, we have to trust that like the pilot knows more about flying than we do. Or when we go
Hmm.
to the doctor, we have to trust that like the doctor knows more about medical advice than we do and about, our issue than we do. And I think, obviously there's caveats where, you might know your like personal self more, but I think there is this rise in people, distrusting the government and distrusting information sources. And there's a lot of valid reasons for those, right? And some reasons are not so valid. But it's leading them to this idea idea of like, oh, well, I just did my own research. And I think that belief, the idea that they did their own research is the idea that like that research is like sufficient. But logically speaking, it just can't be because, even before and this is more of like an epistemic governance question back to what you were saying, Ken, about like even before you're going on Google and getting the search results that you have, Google's already pre-selecting and filtering the information that you will even be able to see to then make your own decision and opinion in the first place.
Right.
So like you
Mm.
aren't actually making your own decisions. Most people are just making the only logical decision that they can make from the information that these like tech algorithms are feeding us in the first place. And so that's why you need, people who, are in school and, doing classes with people who are, getting their information from, things outside of tech algorithms, right? People who are studying in PhDs and who aren't just learning information, but they're creating their own
Right.
information, their own
Right.
knowledge, and putting it out into the sphere. Um, so I think it's really difficult, but it obviously is hard because I think different communities for different reasons, there is valid reasons for having like low levels of trust in the government or in information. And I think addressing that, I think is going to be really like fundamental to helping like the epistemic imbalance that we have. Yeah,
Yeah.
especially.
It's interesting because, united we stand, divided we fall. And then you look at the internet and how the commercial space has been designed around personalization,
Mhm.
right? And then you go to personalization that leads to fragmentation, which leads to polarization, which leads
Mhm.
to isolation. And now you have the instability that we're seeing in democratic unions that we used to think were perfectly fine.
Right.
And so, it's do your own research is occurring in that context of where
Mhm.
people are, like Joy said, they tend to be very isolated in their algorithms already.
Mhm.
And, it's not research in any real sense of the term. It's
Right.
more algorithmic, it's more licking your algorithm, right?
Right.
It's
Right.
like,
Mhm.
okay, here's your lollipop, you know, there you go. And, there's
Exactly.
what you're going to eat today. And
Exactly.
that's your research for today.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think it makes it difficult because, we do live in a democracy and we're very blessed to live in one. But, that means that, the way people inform themselves and the decisions that they make do meaningfully impact other people. And I think that's why it's so important to address like the epistemic imbalance we have because you believing this, conspiracy theory about the world doesn't just impact you, it does impact me, right? And we saw that with things like COVID-19. We see that with like who gets voted into office and like what laws are passed to support what things. Like the way that you believe information about the world directly impacts, your neighbor or your cousin, um, your mom, your dad. And so it's just like exceedingly important, I think, to figure out how to address like these belief systems, the way that people develop beliefs, the information that they have access to, the trust that they place in other people to guide them
Right.
successfully. I think it's all, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's like Neil deGrasse Tyson says, science is great because it doesn't care if you believe in it or not. And we're seeing that with the measles outbreaks, right? It's like, yeah, vaccinations, the science says this, but if you don't believe it, guess what? The measles are going to prove that,
Right,
you should
right.
have.
Yeah.
So
Well,
what are you working on now? What's the most exciting thing for you?
Yeah, I think for me, I'm excited. I finished Oxford's broken into trimesters, so I'm my second trimester now, and we're starting thesis research. So I'm really excited. I think I'm gonna do my thesis on anthropomorphism and AI, specifically like self-anthropomorphism, which I'm really excited about. And I think it will be really cool to maybe do like some human AI interaction, seeing how like machines anthropomorphizing themselves, how does that affect the way that people receive that information from machines? Does it make it, more believable? Does it make it more resistant to, belief correction or belief updating, things like that? I think that'll be really cool. So yeah, and then also we just had exams, which the exams themselves were very nerve-wracking. Um, it was a lot. But I always love studying for exams because I think, I really get to like, for Oxford, we have to do three 1,000 to 1,200 word essays for each class in like a 3 hour frame in person. And we have to like write it by like citation. So I had to memorize like 50 papers by like last name and citation year and,
ooh.
200 theories. And like it was very stressful, but I think it's really cool because it like forces you to put different concepts and papers together and really like have a foundation, like evidence-wise, for like why you think the things that you do and like why you're making the argument you're making instead of just kind of making like a sweeping broad, opinion about something. And I think that was really cool, and exciting for me to kind of figure out like, oh, I actually think this because of like, Bori 2020 and this paper and that paper, and they all intersect. And that was really cool. So yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah.
That's awesome. All right. So I think given the time and your generosity, why don't we move on to discoveries of the week?
Yeah, for sure.
Skylar, would you mind kicking us off with discoveries of the week?
Yes. So there was a paper published by the University of South Australia, I believe. It was actually published this week, I think just yesterday.
Hmm.
And it was talking about the intersection between narcissism and misinformation. Um,
Oh,
yeah, it was really cool. There's been a lot of research in the past few years looking at the intersection between narcissism and misinformation, and talking about how people with high levels of narcissism tend to also, they're more likely to believe in conspiracy theories,
Hmm.
because,
Do we
when
know
you
anybody with a high level of narcissism in the world right now?
there's a couple. There's a
There's a
Right.
couple.
couple.
And it's really interesting, narcissists, the excessive centeredness, self-importance, the need for like admiration, that kind of masks low self-esteem. And you can think about, with narcissists, when they believe in conspiracy theories, the reasoning behind it, and the way they're so resistant to change is the idea that like, oh, I just understand something fundamentally that you don't understand. And the
Mm.
reason you don't understand it isn't because the information is false. It's just because like I am just the type of person that would get it and you just aren't. And
Uh,
into their like
it's a so it's a isolating, like it's a power play.
right. It just
Yeah.
goes back into that like sense of like self-importance and like,
Hmm.
self, admiration of like, yeah, of course I understand it and not a lot of other people don't. Like I'm just fundamentally different and like I'm the type of person who would get it. But this
Wow.
study specifically looked at, yeah, it's really, really cool. Especially because like obviously
Makes so much
narcissism.
sense.
Right. And it's interesting because narcissistic personality disorder diagnoses broadly are, maintaining their proportion in society, but narcissism, which is like the subclinical level of narcissism in the populations, that is rising. So, the proportion of people who are exhibiting narcissistic tendencies, even though they don't have enough narcissism to be diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder, that is rising. So you think about that, and then the rise of conspiracies, obviously there's no way to make like an apparent like correlation, but it's just really
Right.
interesting to see like the
Well, and the
rise in
fact that
that.
the media space is suddenly
I
personalized
well,
kind
but
of might help
does it
somebody to be
mean
a
that
narcissist, right?
no, but does it mean that it's contagious?
It is
Um,
through the internet.
yeah, I honestly don't know. I think like my like science brain, I'm like, it's so hard to make any like specific correlations or like causal claims about
Yeah.
it. Um,
But
but I think
maybe not the clinical
mhm,
manifestation, but maybe the tendencies could
right.
become contagious
Hmm.
through different
Well,
Yeah.
I'll
channels.
tell you,
Yeah.
it's the dopamine hit when someone, when you get 35 likes on a Blue Sky post. It's like, oh, all of a sudden, I'm hot stuff, and
Right. Yeah. And it's definitely
that
a cultural
little
thing too.
dopamine trigger. You like, can I
Mhm.
get that tickle again?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and it's like a cultural thing too of like, Americans broadly, have higher levels of narcissism than other countries. And you see that in the way that we do leadership. We're also a more like independent instead of collectivist society and things like that. But the paper also did like an interesting sub-study and found that education level, which is, normally can help moderate the effects of like conspiratorial belief. So like the more educated someone is, the less likely they are to believe in conspiracy theories. Narcissism actually like dulls that effect. So
Mm.
when someone is narcissistic and they're believing in conspiracy theory, that can be the case even if they have a doctorate level degree or even if they have really high levels of education. And so you're seeing like their personality kind of like override their education level, which I think is interesting because it's like, well, then, that's the normal protective factor against conspiracy theories is, education levels, your cognitive reasoning skills. But if you have narcissism and education isn't even that effective anymore,
You just
what this.
explained all the Harvard-educated Fox News hosts in one fell swoop.
So yeah, yeah, yeah. It's
Yeah. Can
very
you shoot me a link to that? We'll put it in the show notes.
yeah, of course, of
Yeah.
course.
That'd be awesome. Joy, do you want to go next or you want me to? Your choice.
I'll go next. Mine is it's local, but it's also science related. So I live here in Colonial Williamsburg in Virginia, and we've known for years in the 80s there was a serial killer on the Colonial Parkway, and it was never solved.
Ooh.
But now it's being solved.
Hmm.
And so they're using the most up-to-date DNA analysis to track people to who they finally identified as the serial killer.
Wow.
He died a while ago,
Right.
but they're still like matching
Mhm.
the victims to the crime. So it seems like it's finally going to be solved
Yeah.
once again. So it's been like 40 years.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
so
That's really
um, and it's really cool that the the scientists kept on the case.
hmm
So
Yeah, that's
That
super
is.
cool. Even the fact that like the genetic testing is able to be done like 40 years later, I think
yeah.
really a testament to scientific evolution. I remember I used to listen to true crime when I was younger, and I just remember like they would always talk about how much better we are at like genetic testing and like fingerprinting and like biometric matchup now than we were even in like the 1990s. Um,
Hmm.
Hmm.
how that has like helped catch so many like killers and
Or
offenders and things.
exonerated a lot of people too.
Yeah, that too.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm.
So, yeah, that's
Yeah.
great.
Yeah.
All right. So, my discovery is what I'm calling AI pablum.
hmm
And it started, my realization started when you have all of the AI sycophancy, right? And you have the anthropomorphism, which you talked about, and about how it tries to act like your buddy. But I was getting ads where they show an old picture, right? So it's a daguerreotype or some sepia toned picture from a wedding in the 1890s of a couple that look very upright and everything. And then they show how the AI animates it. And all of a sudden they're turning to each other and kissing in an adoring fashion and all this stuff. And I'm like, a couple from the 1890s was not turning and kissing publicly, with the
Yeah.
leg lift and blah blah blah. Or they have a picture of like four little boys on a rock with their elbows, and then the AI animates it, and they're like all happy with each other. And I'm like, chances are one of those kids made an obnoxious or kicked one of the others in,
Mhm.
behind the scenes, and they turned into a fist fight. You don't know what really happened, so you get this AI created not only false history, but it's always got to be a schmaltzy kind of
Mhm.
happy history, right? It's not
Hmm.
what actually happened, but they're recreating versions of events that never happened that
Mhm.
could override. And human memory is pretty fungible, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
especially when you talk about like crime and things like
Mhm.
that, people can get confused about, was the suspect, did he have red hair? Did he have brown hair? Was he 6 foot
Right.
two? Was he 5'11"? All this stuff. And all of a sudden you have these things. And then there was just something, a good essay from the internet safety people about what they're calling the attachment economy,
Mhm.
and that AI is spawning rather than the attention economy.
Mhm.
And it just made me realize that the real danger of all these AI systems is that we
Mhm.
become attached to them in the same way we become attached to social media. And we forget that reality is a lot cooler
Mhm.
and much more fun and
Yeah.
much more interesting and much more sciency.
Yeah.
So that was
That's
my
so
discovery of the week.
yeah. I think that's really even like the first thing you were saying, I think is really cool because my lab in undergrad that I did research at was a memory lab. And we talked a lot about like the continued influence effect and the idea that like, Johnson and Seifert 1996, I think. And the idea that, people will continue to rely on false information even after like a correction has been introduced, not even because of like political reasons or motivated reasoning, confirmation bias, but simply because of the fact that like when you introduce a correction, the falsehood doesn't just disappear out of your memory.
Right, it's
Like
stealing your
you're
neurotransmitters.
eh,
Yeah.
right, and then you're fighting, which like either one, they're both fighting for activation. Anytime you think about that, like general like memory network concept, um, so you can think about that with like the pictures you're talking about with AI, how like people are gonna start having these like false, mental representations or like constructs about like what the 1890s were like, or things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And even
Mm-hmm.
if we correct them, it's still not like guaranteed to have any meaningful like impact on like the way that
Hmm.
we think about the 1890s, which is a little scary. And I think the second thing you said is really interesting too when you think about like cognitive offloading, and increasingly how AI is like embedded in every single thing, and the idea that like, oh, if we just need to make everything as efficient as possible and like automate as many things as possible. um, and people are losing a lot of skills. Like, I
Mm-hmm.
really worry if certain people would be able to write like an email anymore. I think it would take them maybe a few minutes when it used to take them 30 seconds, just because everything's a skill that you build up, and when you don't use it you lose it.
Hmm.
Mm-hmm.
um, and so I think that's very interesting, just like increasing reliance on AI for everything. And you kind of miss, what the value of like doing things as a human, even if it takes more time, even if it's harder. Because like you
Yeah.
said, reality is super cool. So
Yeah. 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 Well,
yeah.
Skylar,
Well,
thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it, and we'll look forward to all the fantastic things you're going to do for the world.
yeah, you're tackling some really important topics, and you're really great at talking about it. So keep up the
Thank
good
you.
work.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you guys for having me.
All right. Take care.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. Bye.
Bye.
All right. Well, that was great. That was
Yeah.
this is going to go down as one of my favorites, I think. But we've had
Yeah.
so many great guests. I mean, I just am, and I know we've got a few more coming up. I'm just always amazed at how, like, the fact that we decided to do interviews has been the best thing we ever decided to do. I
It
think.
really, well,
I'll say
the
second best.
but no, I guess the best
We
idea
don't need to
was
rank order them.
no, we've had some other good ideas, but no, it's the learning part,
Mm,
and the, there's only so much that you and I can talk to each other about, and that's not the point of us having this platform. It's
right.
to continue to explore concepts and learn more about them, and then start to push new ideas further. And so
Yeah.
Skylar was a great example of somebody who was generous enough to give us a bit of her time and help us learn some new things.
From the Oxford Library.
Hmm.
Look at us being all fancy and international. I love it. All right. Well, we're going to close this out. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks to our friends at Provoke the Truth for the music. If you have topics you want us to cover, please email us at disruptedscience@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you. You can also keep up with developments at the Geyser, where you can subscribe to support our efforts. And thanks for listening.
Thanks so much. See you later.